I went to Adelaide after the split of the band. He went to Sydney. He joined a band which became Fraternity, and they moved to Adelaide, which is where I was. I was there writing a column for a rock and roll magazine. I was writing a column for music on a daily paper, Rupert Murdoch's first paper actually, and at that stage his only paper, which is called the Adelaide News, and also for the only television station that Rupert Murdoch owned, which was NWS9. And I had a rock program. I hosted a rock program on that. Bon and his band came over to Adelaide to live. They were Adelaide lads, and they were proficient musicians. They were good musicians. They'd been up in Sydney and worked up there in the club scene for the American R&R people during the Vietnam years, and they were solid musicians, real musicians. And Bon had found his niche. You know, that was what he needed, and Bon was what they needed because he was a front man, and he became, when he left us, he became a showman. He learnt from us, from the Valentines, and no question about that. He'd had, virtually, 10 years being a showman up front, and he was what they needed as well. He was a front man with a good voice and a good appeal for an audience. They came to Adelaide to live. They were picked up by a millionaire there called Hamish Henry, who financed them, put them up in a house up in the hills in Aldgate, in the Adelaide Hills, and their main influences were the band, or the band were their heroes. And like the band were in a country house recording, they wanted to do the same thing. So they basically lived in exclusion. They were a very lucky band. They were financed by, bankrolled by somebody while they achieved their dreams. The dream was to go to England and Europe and then go over to America. Bon and I struck up, Bon and I came over. At that stage I was doing all those things, but I was also, so when they came over, I had them on the show whenever I could. Bon and my relationship continued as friends. I met someone, got married, had a child. Bon was very much part of all of that. He was there, and I was very involved in the band. I loved the band and promoted them at every chance I got. I even did a record with them at one stage, and the fraternity relationship was one that Bon had with Fraternity was all in. It was their own bubble. They believed that they were the best band in the world. They were, again, going to conquer the world. And it was also a time of many magic mushrooms being dropped and lots of alcohol being drunk. And that became part of Fraternity as well, without a doubt. And they were pretty heady times. And they did leave for England and Europe, and they, I think, came over for about 6 months, 12 months. But to cut a very long story short, they failed, ran out of money. Their bankroller wouldn't bankroll them anymore, and they returned to Australia to regroup. It was at this stage that Bon decided to leave Fraternity. Now, there are many stories and many aspects of this story, but the reality is Bon was going to leave Fraternity, and Fraternity at this stage had second thoughts about Bon for whatever reasons. Whatever the situation, it frayed, and Bon was also having a hard time in his relationship because being on the road all the time, and his marriage, I should say. And he started to get really drunk and play. He also started to perform with a band called the Mount Lofty Rangers, which was a loose group of people led by a guy called Peter Head. And the idea of the band was that it had a basically permanent rhythm section, but it would have a flotation of other people who are either out of work or whatever, and many of Australia's key singers and players passed through the ranks of the Mount Lofty Rangers. In all the annals of rock and roll history, in Australian rock and roll history, you don't see the Mount Lofty Rangers mentioned a lot, but they were very pivotal, very key for a lot of people at that time. It was during a rehearsal one night, during one of these rehearsals that the Mount Lofty Rangers had in an Adelaide pub in North Adelaide called the Red Lion, that Bon got really drunk after having an argument with a member of the band. I think it was actually the old bass player of Fraternity. I could be wrong on that one. Got very drunk and used to drink a lot of brandy straight from the bottle, and decided to get on his Harley motorbike and scream off to see someone. He was in a really foul mood. I mean, the thing about Bon was, as anybody who knows him well, is he could turn very quickly. He could turn into a really bad mood, an aggressive mood. I don't think it was in his nature. I think it was the alcohol talking. But a lot of people turn aggressive with alcohol. Bon was one of them. Anyway, he ripped off on his Harley Davidson bike into the darkness of the night. And later on that night, and the night went on, later on that night, around about midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call from Irene, his wife, saying, "Vince, can you come and pick me up? Bon's been in an accident, he's nearly dead." And I went and picked up Irene, we went to the hospital, and indeed, he was in hospital. He had a fractured skull, he had crushed ribs, he had all his teeth were missing, his jaw was wired up, and he was a mess. He was that way for a few nights. And on about the third or fourth night I went in there, and of course, Bon of old was back in spirit and, making lurid remarks about the nurses and, all the rest of it. It was, quite funny to see this guy wired up and his teeth missing and, bandages around his head and, making his lurid remarks about the nurses, all of whom loved it, because they loved Bon. Bon was an impish character who the girls loved, and why not? And anyway, he came out of hospital in the end. He didn't have anywhere to stay. He'd broken up with Irene, and he came and stayed with my wife and I, Helen and I, and lived with us while he was recuperating. And he also helped me. At that stage, I'd left all the immediate things I was doing, and I'd become an agent. And Bon stayed there, and I also he needed some cash, and I employed him, just doing stuff around the house, like painting the office and, stuff like that, and driving a few bands here and there that I had coming over as an agent. And he was a mate, and we were working. It wasn't like he was working for me. It was just, I was helping out a mate, and I knew that it was only, a break between whatever he was going to do next. But it was also obvious that he was going to get on with the job when he recuperated. In fact, that's all he talked about. He had a limp. He found it very difficult to walk. He had a walking stick, and he was worried that he would not be able to get up and sing again, let alone move around on stage and all that sort of stuff. So he was a bit worried. That was also the time, though, that he started to sit down and write songs. And the aforementioned Peter Head put a lot of time into Bon, helping him play guitar, helping him form songs, and they did a lot of recording. In fact, there's a couple of recordings around that Bon did with Peter that have since been released that Bon did with Peter. They were country songs, and nothing like AC/DC, nothing like Valentines. And that's when Bon's songwriting and, more importantly, his lyric writing really began. And he started to write about real things, about girls he met, making love, the things that songs are about. And there's no question that's where he started to hone his craft of his lyric writing and songwriting and the formation of a song. And he was very eager to get back into it.